Hey everybody, Yankee here. You know, one of the big trends in handguns lately has been low bore axis. You know, you see it with the Lago Alien, the Hudson H9, which is now the Daniel Defense H9. You know, you see a lot about that lower bore axis making guns easier to shoot. And this isn't a new thing. You know, back in the past, people used to make fun of SIGs and Berettas because they had a higher bore axis. And people would say, well, that just makes them harder to handle. But does it really? Is low bore axis really a thing? Is it really something that affects how the gun shoots? Or is it just marketing? Just another way to take your money, to design expensive guns, tell you they're special, and get you to part with your hard-earned cash. Well, before we talk about that, let's look at what bore axis really is and how you compare them to other guns. Because one of the things people say that are detractors of guns like the Lago Alien is they say, well, you know, the difference is only like 1/8 of an inch. So like I said, let's look at them side by side here, see how big the difference is, and then talk about how that affects recoil. First, let's compare a gun that has a very low bore axis, the Lago Alien, and let's compare it to a gun that has a notoriously high bore axis, the Beretta 92. Now, the first thing people do wrong often when they're comparing the bore axis is they'll just line up the fronts of the guns. And they'll be like, well, that's not a very big difference. But you don't line up the front of the gun. You also don't line up the triggers. A lot of people will think, you know, where the barrel is in relation to the trigger is what matters. That's not right either. What matters is where the barrel is in relation to where your hand is on the gun. Where is the path of that recoil? Where is it going to go? And that's where your hand lines up, where your wrist and your forearm line up on the back of the gun. That's where you measure bore axis from to see if it's very high or very low. And if you'll notice on the Beretta here, it's way up here. It's pretty far up from the actual line of recoil here, for lack of a better name here. And then if you look at the Lago, it's much lower. In fact, this difference isn't like 1/8 of an inch. This difference is like 1 1/4 inches. Because here's the thing, when that recoil is traveling backwards, it's actually hitting a pivot point where your wrist is, and the higher that bore axis is in relation to that pivot point is how much more energy it's going to take to keep that barrel down. And if you look at another gun that isn't as notoriously high as the Beretta here, you'll see that the difference is not as big, but it's still there. If you look at it compared to a G19 and you line it up properly and you look at where the line of recoil is and then you look at the bore axis of the Glock and the bore axis of the Lago Alien, there's still a difference. Not as big as there was with the Beretta. This is only like 3/4 of an inch difference. But when you look at that little angle that's going to show you where the recoil is going to pivot from and to, that shows you the difference. There is actually a pretty big difference here. So does that mean that guns with a lower bore axis are always going to shoot better? You're going to feel less recoil? And guns with higher bore axes, you're always going to feel more recoil? No, it doesn't mean that at all. Because even though there is a difference, those angles do make a difference. It's how much of a difference do they make? And is it something that you're going to notice in everyday shooting? The difference is there, but can you perceive it? And there's other factors here. If a gun with a really low bore axis shooting the same loads weighs a lot less, well, then it's going to absorb less of that energy and you're going to see more recoil. And you're probably going to see more recoil because of that weight compared to a gun who's heavier and absorbs more of that energy. That difference there is going to be bigger than the difference made by the bore axis. So even though you will see a difference, there will be a measurable difference because of the lower bore axis, it won't be enough to overcome the difference created by the weight of the heavier gun. The heavier gun will feel like it recoils less. Now, another factor you're going to have to take into account is how much energy is that gun actually generating? Is it a 9mm? Is it a 10mm? Is it a 357 Magnum? Because that's going to make a difference. Let's say that the lower bore axis saves you 10%. As far as the energy needing to overcome the recoil. So let's create a scale from 1 to 10 of how much energy you need to manage that recoil. Let's say it's a 9mm, so it's a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10 recoil-wise. You save 10% of that energy, you save 0.3. It goes down to a 2.7 as far as recoil energy now. That's not much of a difference. But if it's a 10, let's say it's 357 Magnum. Let's say it's a 9. But if it's a 9, let's say it's 357 Magnum, and it saves 10%, well, that saves you 0.9. Takes you down to 8.1 on that scale. That saves you 0.9. That's 3 times greater than with the 9mm. So as you get into guns that have heavier calibers and have more recoil, that bore axis becomes even more important. A perfect example of this is guns that I really love, the Chiappa Rhinos that you see over my shoulder here. They're 357 Magnum, most of them. Some of them are 38. You can shoot 38s in them. There's some 40 ones, but mostly they're 357 Magnum, and that's where you notice most of the difference because you're saving a bigger number on recoil. Let's say the recoil is a 9. Like I say, with this bore axis, you're going to save even more than average because look at where this bore axis lines up with where the energy is. They're almost on the same plane. So you're probably going to save a lot more. Let's be conservative and say 20% instead of 10%. So what's 20%? Well, that's a full 2. So that takes you down to 7. So you really notice the difference in that case because you're starting off with a higher energy round. It takes more energy to control the gun. You've got an even lower bore axis, so it saves you an even bigger percentage of a higher energy anyway. So even though it'll be more difficult to control this gun than it would if it was 9mm, still overall, when you're comparing it to other guns of the same caliber and of similar weight, this one's going to handle recoil so much better. And that's basically how bore axis works. You take into account those things. Now, on most guns, most semi-autos, especially 9mm, is it going to make a difference? And that's what you see most of these guns chambered in, 9mm. It's going to make a difference, but not enough to overcome the weights of the guns. The weights of the guns are going to be more important than the bore axis in most cases. But is there an actual difference? Yes, there is an actual difference. It might shave 1/1000th of a second off of your time between rounds because of how much less recoil there is. And does that matter in your daily life? Will you notice it? Probably not. Especially not if you're using your gun in self-defense. I can almost guarantee you won't notice it. But when would it be important? It would be important when you're shooting competition and every little fraction of a second matters. So that's when bore axis really matters. When you're either shooting at the range for time, you want to beat your time, you want to be better every time, well then bore axis really factors in. If you're shooting competition, bore axis factors in because you're dealing with tiny little numbers that wouldn't even be perceptible until you look at the timer. Whereas in your everyday life, you're not looking at a timer. So bore axis isn't a fad. It's something that self-defense guns have taken from competition shooting. And a lot of the stuff we take nowadays as part of the carry world came from competition. And lower bore axis is just another one of those things. So no, it's probably not going to make much of a difference in your life if you're shooting 9mm. It can make a much bigger difference if you're shooting something like 357 Magnum. But unless you're shooting competition, unless you're timing yourself, it probably won't matter to you. So it's not worth shelling out those big bucks, I wouldn't say. But like I said, some people want every tiny little advantage they can get. Some people even will point a gun at their penis and their femoral artery to save 1/1000th of a second on their draw. So it really comes down to whether it matters enough to you to spend the extra money. To me, it wouldn't. But if you're someone that shoots competitively or just likes to have every advantage you can have, low bore axis is not only not a myth, it's something you can actually measure.